Hi, I'm Pastor Mira, and this is Sermon in 3 Minutes. Throughout the season of Lent here at Carlisle United Methodist Church, we've been looking at the book Restored by Tom Berlin and looking and learning about God's grace. We talked about prevenient grace, grace that comes to us from God even before we know it or understand it, justifying grace, the grace of God that comes to us in that when we make a commitment to follow and to be one of God's children, and saving grace, the act of Jesus dying on the cross for us. That's what we looked at this past week. We looked really at the word atonement, and that means that we are reconciled with God, that humans who are sinful because of Jesus are reconciled, and the rifts between us and God are taken away because of Jesus' act on the cross. Professor Josh Thoreau of UT San Antonio gives a great example online on YouTube about what is atonement and how do we understand that? How are rifts created? And how can we remove them? Well, back in Leviticus, an Old Testament book of the Bible, chapter 23, we learn of the Day of Atonement, and the day when the Jewish people would atone for their sins, when they would confess for 10 days straight all their sins of the past year, and then their high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and make confession for their sins, his family's sins, and sins of the entire community. Today, we know of that as Yom Kippur. And it's an annual day of atonement for our Jewish friends, the last day of their year. They do that because we know from Psalm 53, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Well, let's fast forward all the way to Jesus, to Holy Week. When he is in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's praying because he knows that God has called him to big things. He also knows that the humans that he's befriended, they fall short. They're sinful. They make mistakes. And through his prayer time, Jesus learns that he must go to Calvary and he must die on the cross. Sacrifice, the sacrifice of blood, was necessary to atone for one's sins. In the Old Testament, it was done by a bull, but then every year the high priest had to go back and do it again. Well, Jesus, his sacrifice is blood on the cross. Crucifixion in Jesus' time was only reserved for the most heinous of crimes and for non-Romans and slaves. It actually comes from the Latin torture. It was a way to die that was public and painful. Well, Jesus was crucified, that we know, because he went to the cross. And on the cross, he became what we learn in Hebrews is our great high priest. He died, his blood was sacrificed so that the sins of all people then at the cross, our ancestors, us today, and even those yet to come, he sacrificed his blood for all of us. In Hebrews, he's called the great high priest, meaning that for once and for all, that he gave his life, that it's not needed to be done as a yearly atonement, but that everyone from now forward would be able to stand before God. That when we stand before God as sinful people, God actually sees Jesus' cloak of love surrounding us, and that cloak of love allows us to have eternal life with God. That's a brief summary of what we looked at this past week. Check out Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. It's Paul's letter telling the people of Rome about how they are saved and about Jesus' act. Thanks for listening. I hope you have a great week.